I'm just going to make some loose notes about type. I don't know if some of these comments should actually be generalized across all different types. I don't know what the effect would be as a kind of prescriptive thing because, well, there's so many different subcategories of type. What I'm about to say might not be a therapeutic path for most types, but in as much as keeping in the same vein of understanding how the ego effectively plunders um, the unconscious, and how the super ego has the ability to destabilize or to um, administrate over the subconscious, and that basic symmetry within the type, I believe, means that there can be a way of generating enough internal understanding of internal dynamics between functions that there can be a kind of special maturity that occurs that gets you into a meta developmental stage where you can actually sort of uh, develop past the type itself. And so I see that there are different, I don't want to pigeonhole this comment because I think there are other ways of describing the same kind of thing. But there are different ways in which obviously there are many different species of what I would call spiritual possession, or which really has to do with a kind of a style of inclination, a style of being sort of invested in an atrophied, recurring pattern, which stops the kind of meta development, which is sort of a stumbling block on the path to developing that symmetrical internal understanding. Not that the understanding is symmetrical, but that the understanding comes from having more experience built up in seeing those symmetry, seeing how that symmetry, which is effectively would be something like rehabilitating self-determinism and your sense of accountability. Now, the cognitive functions themselves are quite interesting because they can be seen as a kind of independent factor. Although that they engage with the world, they are not quite the same thing as the world itself. They give rise to your experience, but they are not just a kind of objective external or exterior condition to be experienced. Okay, I'm not going to elaborate on that, but that was just to sort of set some of this context. Now, what I was going to say as well, on the issue of spiritual, a kind of ideation itself, or not even just ideation, but I think another way, and this might be completely disparate and a completely different subject and topic to what I've just spoken about, but another way of characterizing some kind of taxonomy on spirit is when people are invested in their thinking with a certain kind of certainty, and their intellect is not able to sort of fluidly pervade around those issues. Another way of describing it is there's a famous saying, I think, the difference between genius and intellectual. Intellectuals solve problems, geniuses avoid them, is often what's said. Now, the method to solve a problem, the kind of the formulaic thinking, or the kind of the 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 expression of principles is not the same thing as uh, a pure principle in essence. And so when you have a kind of a sense of principles and how they impact on each other, you'll never be able to lock yourself into a configuration of expression. Um, Essentially, you will always need a procedure that is capable of okay, this is a bit tricky because this itself could be reduced to a kind of formula. Um, but there has to be real discerning in the utilization of principles, essentially. Um, and that, in some sense, the greatest principle, therefore, is something like discerning itself, and the responsibility to be discerning about things. Now, and that would be the mark of almost real spiritual life, or life on the level of the meta development, in that it's not just stuck into its kind of spiraling pattern or recurring loop, or whatever. So another way also of I really wanted to bring this up because I was thinking about it, although now I'm not fully remembering the point that I wanted to make about it. Thinking about ideologues and sort of especially with identity politics, the kind of the insulated rationality in inverted commas, is hinged on a cognitive dissonance that essentially, reality, you really do have to engage in a kind of self-hypnotism in terms of your certainty about the primacy of certain categories, certain conceptual categories have to be just kind of taken blindly on presumption. Now, in some sense, another way of talking about discerning or otherwise spiritual possession or something like that would be the idea that one knows the presumptions that one is making in an area, and one is being open about it, and one is being open to negotiating if those presumptions are appropriate or not, or if there wouldn't be a better configuration to sort of to continue on the basis thereon. Now, that kind of allowance, that kind of humility, vulnerability, susceptibility, can itself also be the grounds of a further toxicity, in that if people are kind of on the nihilistic sort of skepticism spectrum, where they know that it's a presumption, they know that it could just as well be something else, but they are so in love with some image, with some imagined future vision, that they have a prophecy effectively that they don't mind fulfilling, and they are actively fulfilling that prophecy effectively. I think this is also, if you decode the scriptural language, this is what is actually being spoken about. That it's spoken about in two ways, where there's a plural of false prophets and a singular of false prophet. In some sense, in the spiritual sense, there is one false prophet. In the kind of in the material sense of being in a society of more than one person, it is expressed as many false prophets are gone out into the world. They cannot go out unto the world because they cannot execute their will. The prophecy never ends. It's a continual guarantee that has to be underwritten by the believer. So it's a form of, as Nietzsche would put it, slave morality. And slave morality is incredibly seductive, dangerous, because it is a false religion. Effectively, it has, and essentially replaces real compassion and real care with a kind of with a quite a vile and sly sympathy, where everything is covered in these sorts of these webs of sympathy. I think this is what Dali was depicting in one of his art pieces, which I think was around the time of the kind of the culture that gave birth to Nazi Germany, effectively, which is much the same cultural phase that we are in at the moment, where you see the people riding around on bicycles with a fountain in the middle, and everything, all their from their heads down, they're covered in these spider webs, in these insular, and I guess the idea is that the webs are part of a kind of pervasive matrix of some sort, but it's all atrophied and dead. They're all just running around on their bicycles in their spider webs. Anyway, that's my interpretation of that piece, at least. But so now, just going back to the psychology part. So I think that most forms of arrested development have to do with effectively the ego has not been given actually its full latitude to completely dominate the unconscious mind. And that's a big one, because the unconscious mind was here first, according to my ontology of this system. And if the ego does not fully deconstruct it and show its weakness and actually really probe its limits, then you are at an impasse. You have no way to develop. And so a lot of false religion, a lot of ideology really has to do with creating convenient general maneuvers and general beliefs that are convenient into insulating the unconscious mind. And this is obviously incredibly dangerous, because that level of immaturity will effectively always be projected and exteriorized onto the environment, onto, and it will have to eventually find a point that it coalesces, and sort of you have to have a kind of a symbol of blame or something like that, and yeah, cultures like this eventually, I don't know how long they can actually survive before they sort of, because they promise these certainties, they give out these certainties, and when they are challenged, they have to kind of be brittly defended. And you can only do that effectively by villainizing some kind of exterior power or force. And so you get this kind of in-group righteousness and out-group scapegoating. And there has to be a huge schism within the leadership of some societies for them to even operate. In some level they always have to say, well, yeah, we have the ideology for the plebs, and then we have the ideology for the administrator class, and essentially you have a kind of a cult esoteric society where the real leadership are like the world controllers, or like the managers, are like the intelligentsia, and they have none of the shared beliefs as the plebs, which are effectively being socially engineered, so that their anxiety is replaced with a kind of a sympathy that they can rely on, at the general cost of honesty and transparency and clarity. And there's obviously in that loss of transparency, you open the door to a level of corruption which is unfathomable. It's very grotesque usually, and usually those disparities themselves create weird kind of ideological tension within people's minds themselves, and it's eventually, I believe, it's unsustainable because you end up having such rigid power structures. Anyway, and so I think generally this is why cultures generate subcultures, which are often, they are seen as more vibrant because they're sort of these pockets of self-righteousness, and eventually they kind of evolve or fizzle out, or they're unsustainable because they're confronted with their incoherence and they're not really able to resolve them in an intelligent way because they're not operating on the basis of a real intelligence, of a humble intelligence. They're operating on essentially creating a cult around fortifying the unconscious mind. So if the ego is allowed to take the unconscious to task, then I would say you would have a much more self-awareness of the unconscious. And I wouldn't say that this would mean that you would be based in the unconscious, but somehow you would be based in both the unconscious, and the ego would kind of have a power sharing sort of compact. And the ego would have the upper hand in that way. And the ego would always have the upper hand until the other symmetry was also developed. Because essentially the only thing that is going to bring the ego into a more sort of a more decent arrangement effectively is going to be if the superego is allowed to impact on the subconscious heavily, and therefore kind of resize and reposition the ego's system of privileging its cognitive functions. Specifically the child function is a nice summary way of talking about it, but there might be other more effective ways. But basically the child function needs to, through its parent role in the subconscious, be dismantled and properly debased and critiqued effectively from the position of the superego. And then you will have that kind of meta development that is free of a kind of a decadent self-investment and such. Now, what I was going to say also about the child function.